Hello, everyone. I am Doreen Tannenbaum, the Strategic Initiatives and Communications Manager for UCI's Procurement Services, and welcome to our Department Buyer meeting today. We have our Export Controls Officer joining us today, and we are also going to be going over our end-to-end procurement process updates. The presentation is going to be followed with some questions and answers at the end. So please hold off on any questions, and you can unmute yourself at the end or go ahead and add them to the chat and we'll read them out loud. The recording for today's session is going to be available on our website, and I will be sending out an email by next week. The slide deck is available right now. If you don't have it, I will also drop it in the chat for you to follow along. So I want to introduce our website. We've made a couple of updates on it. This is our training website. We have step-by-step training guides and videos available on this section. You can find it at the top here under training. I also want to highlight our FAQs. I'm going to get to that in a sec as well. What we've added here is our weekly office hours, and I'll go over that shortly. We also have UCLC interactive courses on our UCLC portal. And there's one-on-one and group training sessions available. If you need any assistance with that, please contact us at procurement@uci.edu. And then this is new. We added our weekly virtual office hours a few months ago and have had really great success with attendance. Please join us in the future if you can with any questions you have about requisitions, purchase orders, agreements, policies, or anything else you actually need clarification on. We meet every Tuesday from 9 to 10 a.m. And depending on the questions that we receive, we either go over or end early. So please come prepared with any questions that you have. The FAQs. So I wanted to mention every question that we do receive, we will be updating our FAQs on our website shortly after. And there is a calendar link that's available on our training website, and I'll also add it to the chat in just a second. I'm going to turn it over now to Snehal Bhatt. Thank you.
Thank you, Doreen. Good afternoon, everybody. Appreciate you all taking the time from your busy schedules to attend this training session. Hopefully you will find it beneficial and useful to get a better understanding of the export control requirements. And we want to thank our colleagues from Export Control to partner with us to provide the training in collaboration with Procurement Services. Many of you who have been attending these training sessions on a regular basis by now must be very familiar with this slide. But we don't want to miss the opportunity to mention it one more time. And also for those who may be joining this training session for the very first time, we want to make sure that we kind of share with you all some of the fundamentals and basic requirements. Doreen, we lost the share, so presentation is not being shared right now.
One second, I'm sorry about that.
All right, so while Doreen is trying to get back the presentation and start sharing that, I would like to mention to those that may be joining this training session for the first time, that the responsibility for knowing all the required compliances and regulations and policies lies with everybody who is involved in procurement. And so we always request and ask everybody who is engaged in procuring anything for the university to familiarize themselves with the various policies. We do have quite a few policies that we are required to adhere to. Being a public university, we have California state requirements. We have federal requirements because we do receive significant amount of funds from the federal agencies. So we have to make sure that we comply with all the federal and the uniform guidance requirements. Also, UC on its own has quite a few policies that we need to comply with. So, many of the policies that we have, like the small business first policy or the sustainability policy or the covered services policy for contracting out, are all UC policies. And it will be important for everyone to be familiar with these policies so that when you start requesting some purchases, you know what are the documentation that are going to be required, what are the processes you need to follow so that we stay in compliance with all these policies. Compliance is not one of our first core values. Our first core value is customer service and collaboration and generating efficiencies. Compliance is the last of our core values. And but at the same time, it is something that we all are required to fulfill and follow. I also wanted to confirm and make sure that everybody understands that the university, and basically the President Drake for the UC system, has delegated authorities to the chancellor, who has then redelegated those authorities to the vice chancellors and the other functions. The delegated authority for signing any agreements or contracts on behalf of UCI rests with central procurement. So we kindly ask that none of the departments go ahead and sign any of the purchasing agreements or the sales and service agreements on behalf of the university, because that would not be a valid agreement because you don't have the delegated authority to sign those agreements. So I wanted to make sure that you all are aware of that as well. If somebody makes purchases that are not authorized, then they could be personally liable for those purchases and to make those payments for those purchases. So always make sure that you actually have an approval and approved PO when you make a purchase. Of course, when you make purchases on PEL cards, we expect that you have approvals from your fiscal officers to make those purchases. But otherwise, please try not to have purchases made before you actually get approvals and minimize the use of after the fact request for approval of POs. Go to the next slide, Doreen. Okay, so as I mentioned, we have partnered with our colleagues from Export Control who are going to take over and give you an update on what are the requirements of export control. And once that presentation is done, I will give everybody a quick update on where we stand with our end-to-end procurement process. Many of you have been engaged with that process, and many of you have probably already heard about it. We had asked everybody all the schools and divisions to submit a survey. And I would hope that you all were engaged in filling out that survey that we had requested all the various schools and divisions to provide. So you must be familiar with the end-to-end procurement process. By now, at least I've heard of it. And I'll give a very quick update on where we are with that process. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Brian McCurdy for him to take over and talk about export control.
Great, thanks, Snehal. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm very new to this group. I don't know if you've ever seen me before, or if I've interacted with you. I know there's like 150 plus people on this call, so I can't see who all is on here all that well, aside from like maybe 4 or 5 of you on the right hand side. But my name is Brian McCurdy. As Snehal mentioned, I'm the Export Control Officer here at UCI. I joined the campus a little over a year ago after spending the first 10 years of my career at the Santa Barbara campus, where I was also focused on running the export controls compliance program there. I work very closely with another member of the research engagement and compliance team who is also on the call with us today. Her name is Joanna Arias, and Joanna and I are your export controls compliance team. Again, thanks to Snehal and his team for inviting us to be here today with you this afternoon to talk about export controls compliance. For some of you, this is going to be a refresher, and for others, this is the first time you are hearing about this area of compliance. Before I start my presentation, I would like to begin by clearing up a common misconception that we hear a lot in export controls, and that is that export controls compliance is strictly about shipping. When someone hears the word export, they immediately think of an item being sent somewhere overseas. And that's totally understandable. Before I made my living in this area of compliance, I had that same association. And while physical shipments to foreign destinations is the bedrock of export controls compliance, it's not the sole focus of export controls compliance. Export controls compliance encompasses much more than physical shipments being sent overseas. And so I will expand on this point further throughout my presentation. Next slide. So here is our agenda for today. I'm going to begin by providing an overview of the regulatory landscape for export controls compliance. And then I will discuss how these regulations present risks to the procurement operations on campus. And then lastly, we will discuss some examples of procurement activities that have export controls compliance implications. Export control regulations, excuse me, are used by the US government to address a variety of national security and foreign policy objectives. A topical example of the US government utilizing export control regulations for national security and foreign policy reasons can be observed right now, in how the government is utilizing these regulations against Russia for its war on Ukraine. Since the war broke out in Ukraine over 2 years ago, the US continues to use export control regulations to restrict Russia from receiving material from the US that could be used in support of their war. There's also, sanctions on the financial industry in Russia as well, and so that those sanctions prohibit our engagement financially in some instances with Russia as well. Export control regulations are expansive. They cover the export, re-export, and transfer of physical items, technology, software, and services to various end uses, end users, and destinations. I want to place some added emphasis on a couple of words in that sentence: technology, software, services, end uses, and end users. I want to emphasize these words to highlight the point that I just made a moment ago about how these regulations cover much more than just physical shipments. It's important to note that all items, technology, and software located within the United States are subject to these regulations. There are 3 main agencies that administer and enforce these regulations. The first set of regulations that I want to highlight is the Export Administration Regulations, or what is more commonly referred to as the EAR or EAR. The EAR is administered and enforced by the Department of Commerce. The EAR covers products that have both a military and civilian use, or sometimes what's referred to as a dual use. As you can imagine, there are a lot of products purchased by and in use at UCI that are subject to the EAR. Most of the purchasing activity at UCI will be for products that are controlled by the EAR. The compliance risks to UCI from EAR controlled items is pretty low because, again, like I just said, most of the products most products are controlled by EAR and are commercially available and of a lower level technology. In addition to regulating items and software, the Department of Commerce also maintains lists of restricted parties to identify end users who may have restrictions placed upon them that limit their ability to be provided with items, software, and technology that are subject to the EAR. And then next we have the International Traffic in Arms Regulations, or ITAR, which is administered and enforced by the Department of State. The ITAR regulates exports of products or services that are designed, modified, or upgraded for a specific military use or purpose. We have some researchers on our campus who utilize ITAR-controlled products in support of their research. One example that I will share with you is night vision scopes that are currently being used at UCI for health science research. They're designed for military use, but the lab they're being used in does not use them for military purposes, right? They're just using them for fundamental research into biology. The compliance risks to UCI from ITAR-controlled items is very high because of the products. And remember what I said earlier, all physical items, technology, and software located within the United States are subject to export control regulations. The products will be either within the EAR or the ITAR, and 99% of what we purchase at UCI will be considered dual use and would be thus covered by the EAR. Next slide. And then to round out the regulatory landscape, I will also highlight the various sanctions programs that are administered by the Office of Foreign Assets Controls, or OFAC, which is administered and enforced by the Department of Treasury. There are two general categories of sanctions. There are targeted sanctions and comprehensive sanctions. And there are entirely too many sanctions programs imposed by OFAC to go over in this presentation. I want to highlight the biggest risks to UCI, which come from the comprehensively sanctioned countries and regions. And those countries and regions are Iran, Cuba, North Korea, Syria, and regions of the Ukraine that are currently occupied by Russian forces. Similar to the EAR, OFAC also maintains restrictive party lists, and these lists name specific entities that are subject to sanctions under OFAC. The compliance risks to UCI from engaging with a comprehensively sanctioned country are very high, because most engagements with a comprehensively sanctioned country require government authorization. The scope of what falls under OFAC's comprehensive sanctions is very broad. As an example, UCI representatives require government authorization if they want to conduct research or attend a conference in one of the comprehensively sanctioned countries. So they're very, very restrictive. The sanctions restrict U.S. entities from providing certain services to comprehensively sanctioned countries. Next slide. So why is this important, and how does it impact procurement matters at UCI? So here's a short list of some of the risks UCI faces when processing procurement transactions. I referred to the EAR and OFAC restricted party lists in my previous slides. Those lists are created to identify end users who are restricted from receiving items, software, and technology that are subject to the EAR, and end users who are restricted from receiving payments from a US-based organization. UCI must ensure that we are not engaging with individuals or organizations that are sanctioned by the US government. So to address this risk, the procurement staff utilize a screening tool that they vet foreign vendors and suppliers who we wish to engage with, or buy products from. We also encounter risks when a procurement activity involves UCI shipping items to an international destination. The biggest risk here is when materials, samples, and or equipment are shipped from UCI to a foreign destination without going through export controls review. Given the amount of FedEx accounts on campus and the ease of shipping items abroad, this is a really difficult area for Joanna and I to wrap our arms around. We lack a central shipping system or a university mandate to undergo export controls review for all international shipments. So that's a real tough area of compliance for us in this space. Country restrictions, I just referred to the OFAC a moment ago. As I mentioned previously, the sanctions are extremely restrictive, and in most cases, UCI is not allowed to engage in procurement activities involving these countries without authorization from the government to do so. Another area is controlled technologies. Controlled technologies is referring to those technologies that our government has deemed to be of a more sensitive nature. It is rare that we procure these types of technologies, but it can happen from time to time when we are made aware that we are working with these technologies or procuring these technologies. We really have to ensure that they are properly protected while in use at UCI. And then the last area of risk that I wanted to highlight is export control language that you might find in a purchasing agreement. Vendor or supplier documents routinely contain export control and sanctions compliance clauses. Reviewing agreements is really critical to maintaining our compliance program. The vendor or supplier could be telling us in those documents that the things that we are purchasing are controlled. So for today, I would like to focus on just two of these risks, really, and that would be the export control language and control technologies. Next slide. So export control language is usually included in documentation you receive from a vendor or supplier. I'm sure you've all seen markings on packages or documents before that alert you to the fact that A box contains hazardous materials or fragile items. These are what are referred to as handling markings, right? If you saw this particular package on the slide, or were alerted to the fact that there are hazardous materials in a package, you would or should contact our environmental health and safety department, right? After you alert EH&S, they would step in to address the requirements that come along with such materials, right? The same idea is true for export controls compliance. When a vendor or supplier marks something as export controlled, we should be following up with them to request additional information to meet our compliance obligations. Here's an example of a marking that you may see on documents provided by a vendor or supplier. This example here is telling us that the document contains technology that is controlled by the EAR and must be handled in compliance with the Export Control Reform Act. If we were dealing with an ITAR product, the vendor or supplier would instead reference the applicability of the ITAR, right? You just swap the one out for the other. When documents containing markings like this example, we should be following up with the vendor or supplier to understand what we are receiving. This is just, the first step, right? These markings are merely a notification to the buyer and do not include enough details to understand what our compliance obligations are with respect to the purchase. We must know more in order to ensure compliance with the regulations. Next slide. Here is an example of a clause that you might find in a vendor or supplier document in the terms and conditions. I pulled this example from Thor Labs purchasing agreement. This clause is typical of what you will see. It's very generic. A lot of the details are missing. You will see clauses related to these regulations labeled as export controls compliance, global trade compliance, or in the case of this example that I pulled from Thor Labs, it's included in the miscellaneous section of the agreement. Also be on the lookout for foreign national restrictions. If you see something in an agreement that references the need to restrict access to a particular item or product, and they base that restriction on someone's citizenship, that is a big red flag for export controls compliance. In most cases, that has to do with export control regulations, right? When these clauses are present, it does not necessarily mean that we are purchasing something that is highly controlled. It's often the case that this is just boilerplate language, right? I know everyone knows those kinds of clauses, right? And they include, this clause in all of their agreements, and it's just, to cover themselves, right? What we are trying to do and what we aim to do is to weed out those generic ones from ones that warrant follow-up with the vendor or supplier to understand how the things that are being sold to UCI are controlled. Occasionally, a vendor or supplier will require that a certificate be completed related to export controls compliance. Some of you may recognize a document like this, not this particular document. I pulled this one randomly from Google Images, but you may have seen, end user statement, end use statement, end user certification. These certifications are often referred to as end user certificates or certifications. I've also seen them referred to as export control questionnaires. This type of certification request should be a red flag, as these documents are often requested for items, technology, or software that are highly controlled. End users statements are a way for the vendor or supplier to document their export controls compliance program. If anything goes wrong, they can point to that document, which states that we are responsible for complying with export control regulations, and point to that document with our signature on it. If anything were to happen, anything were bad were to happen. When a vendor or supplier is asking for these types of assurances, there is often much more to the story, and we need to ask more, right? All documents like this one must be reviewed by our office prior to being signed. That's very important. Now let's chat briefly about controlled products or technologies. So in very rare instances, UCI may need to purchase equipment, software, or technology that are controlled by the International Traffic in Arms regulations. And also, there are instances where it doesn't fit into either of those buckets, and it could be something that's subject to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Those are very highly controlled as well. Very rare, so I didn't want to include it here, but I just thought I'd mention it. In these cases, it's the responsibility of the vendor or supplier to provide UCI with advance notice of the control status of the purchase. Because working with these items is so restrictive, it is critical for us to identify these items and ensure that proper mechanisms are being established to protect that product prior to the purchase being made, right? We should really make sure that we have all the controls in place, the ability to work with that item, in the way that it needs to be on our campus before that purchase is made, right? You could have a situation where, a faculty member, cannot meet the obligations that are required of them to protect these items, right? And so it's really important to identify those at the outset so that if an alternative needs to be sought, that they can seek an alternative to whatever the item might be, right? Because some vendors do have ITAR controlled products and then non-ITAR controlled products, because they know that the restrictions that come along with ITAR are administratively burdensome, and so they have the non-ITAR option because they realize that some folks do not want the responsibility to that comes along with ITAR restrictions. So I've included 2 examples of equipment that could be purchased in support of research here at UCI. One of the items, the item at the bottom left, is a highly controlled product offered by FLIR that can be used in support of many different types of research at UCI. It can also be used in support of military operations, right? So that's where that dual use idea comes in, right? And then the other item that I included on here as well is an autonomous underwater vehicle used for oceanographic research or marine biology. There is contained within that, AUV, there's a little navigation, an inertial navigation system that is controlled for military purposes. It was specifically designed for the military. And because that is contained in that item, the whole thing becomes ITAR controlled. So both of these items are highly restrictive and would require our campus to establish measures to safeguard them. So next slide, please. This slide has several examples that you can read through. They're not very specific or hyper specific. I've kind of already mentioned them, but those are examples that do come up from almost probably every single day at UCI in the procurement operations, right? In addition to these examples, I also want to provide you with an example from many, many years ago. Back in 2018, the UC filed disclosure to the Department of State to inform the federal government that nearly all of our campuses had inadvertently violated the ITAR. The violations occurred when international students and scholars who were studying at UCI or studying or researching at UCI were exposed to highly controlled cameras and technical information related to those cameras. In conducting an internal review of the circumstances surrounding the violation, it was revealed that the vendor or supplier informed the UC of the control status of those cameras in the documentation that they had provided to the institution. The markings were there, but most of the individuals who processed those purchases didn't know what they meant and didn't know that they needed to be escalated for further review. So we submitted that disclosure. The government came back and responded to the disclosure and had a lot of requests for us. One of the requests was that the UC implement a number of changes to increase compliance with ITAR, and to ensure that this doesn't happen again, right? And one of the commitments that we made to the federal government pertained to training purchasing staff on what the regulations are and how to spot issues related to the regulations, right? So there's been a renewal of efforts in this space, and hence why I am here with you today. This presentation really is intended to familiarize you with export controls, and give you some exposure to some of the issues that can come up. There will be forthcoming communications and training opportunities that will get deeper into the procedural aspects of what will need to be done to ensure compliance and to meet the obligations that we've made to the federal government about, how we were going to fix that particular issue that arose back in 2018. So there's going to be more on this topic, very soon, but I just wanted to get in front of you all today to just give you, again, a very brief overview of export controls compliance, and give you a little bit of insight into, how it can affect and will affect, or how it can affect your jobs in procurement. And yeah, that concludes my presentation. I hope that I was able to provide a little bit of insight into export controls and how they impact the purchasing operations. Joanna and I are always here to help, and you can ask us questions whenever you feel the need to ask questions. But for now, I'm going to turn it over to Snehal, and I will be able to answer questions at the very end of the presentation.
Thank you very much, Brian. Truly appreciate your time and coming in and sharing with everybody on this in this training some of the basic requirements of export control. The biggest challenge we obviously are going to face when it comes to compliance with export control is catching those instances when the suppliers have embedded in their terms some of the language for export control. And that's one thing that I want to make sure that everybody that's on this, in this training gets that understanding that that is one reason why when we are making purchases and we have suppliers who submit with quotes, and basically at the bottom of their quote, they may have a sentence saying, and you shall comply with the terms and conditions of the supplier, and the supplier has a link to the terms and conditions. If we don't pay attention to that link, open that link, read through the terms and conditions and see if there is anything that's pertaining to export control, we are very, very likely to miss that language in their agreements. And that's another reason why people have to recognize that sometimes things take longer for us to process. We can't just blindly just click a button and hit approve when we have situations like this that we need to be very mindful of and be careful with. So that's another reason why we need to also inform our faculty and PIs that, and that I would expect and hope that the departmental buyers will take that responsibility to kind of educate the PIs and faculty who should be very much familiar and aware of some of the export control requirements. But again, their job is to do research. Their job is not to think about all the different compliances, but it is our responsibility to inform them and say that, hey, depending on what you're purchasing, there could be situations where export control may be in play, and we need to pay close attention to that. So I also want to let everybody know that as we are going through this end-to-end procurement review process, we are trying to implement changes to our systems, incorporate some of the checklists and some of the things that we may want to start reviewing and create workflows where the appropriate departments are engaged in the process. And so at this point, most of you probably know that we do have controlled substances routed to EH&S for the review before it's approved. Similarly, we are going to consider possibly having a workflow where export control may be engaged in situations where we may feel like this purchase has an element of export control. And so that's the kind of improvements we are trying to make in the processes in our systems, where depending on the purchase, the flow is routed, the request is routed to the appropriate departments for them to conduct their reviews and give their approvals before we move forward with the purchase. So we will be engaging Brian and Joanna and involving them in the areas where export control comes into play, so that we don't miss out on something and then have to go back to the federal government and, as Brian mentioned, ask them for forgiveness for not complying with some of the requirements. Having said that, I would like to spend a few minutes today to give everybody a very, very quick update on where we are with the end-to-end procurement review process. Essentially, this whole project started for us to help improve the processes and create some efficiencies in the process. Because as we all know, really, we don't have a pure procurement system that can help us with everything pertaining to procurement. We have Quali Financial System, KFS, that we are using today for making purchases, but Quali really is a financial system, not necessarily a procurement system. It does have the PureUp module, which is a purchasing and accounts payable module that we are utilizing, but it does not embed all the requirements of procurement and does not have the required workflows that we will be looking for. So at this point, we are more than a year into this project, and it's very obvious the fact that it's taking such a long time for us to actually get to the end point is that procurement at UCI is not as simple as going on Amazon and making a purchase for your home goods. As we have been repeatedly saying, being a public university and a research R1 university, receiving several federal funds, we do have quite a few compliance requirements that need to be taken into account, export control being an example of that. So our purchases are quite complex. The requirements that we have to fulfill, all the checks and balances that we have to consider are quite complex. And so we have been through the entire discovery phase. We spent several months with a few of the units from the campus trying to understand all the various nuances of the purchases. We did the discovery, we did the analysis, and now we are in the implementation phase. Doing all the analysis, we realized that we do need to have a system that supports many of these compliance requirements built into the process. And so we actually have gone ahead and spent considerable amount of time developing the future state process map. We have identified that we need to actually have a requisitioning process. We need to then have a purchase order approval process, contracting process, and then ultimately place the order and source the purchase. In that whole process, we are also trying to identify very specific roles that individuals need to play in the departments and within central procurement in order to process the purchases. And by defining the various process steps and the roles, we hope to provide specific training to those roles and have them be very familiar with all the things that they need to do in order to make sure that everything is in compliance. So that's where we are right now. We are going through and developing that entire process map with very detailed understanding of the role that individuals need to perform at each stage in the process. We hope to have all the processes defined in the next coming weeks. We then plan to socialize that with the other units within UCI that also have engagement with procurement, make sure that everything looks good. We'll probably engage the units to understand and make sure that they fully are on board with the future state that we are trying to implement. At the same time, we have also identified all the various changes we need to make within the KFS system in order for us to actually make that system more effective and efficient. And we had identified close to 13 different changes that need to be made in KFS. And we have been working closely with the KFS development team to understand the time it's going to take for them to make the necessary changes to KFS. It's a pretty significant effort required to make the changes. And based on the estimates that they have provided, in order for us to get some of the very essential things completed, which is about 6 of those 13 items, it probably is going to take them almost a year to make all the necessary changes in KFS. In the meantime, we have also been exploring other potential systems that are actually meant for procurement, and we are evaluating alternate systems as well to see if they will be a better option for us to explore rather than KFS and making all the changes in KFS. Because the changes in KFS are very hard-coded and it does not allow us to configure or customize. If there's any changes to be made, we need to have our programmers again go back and make changes to the system. So we are also looking at options where we can do things in a dynamic fashion, maybe make changes and customize or configure and make changes as and when needed. We're not in a position to right now share more specifics on those decisions, but we have been discussing it with management, and hopefully we will have the approvals or this direction on which way to go. And once we have the approval from the senior management, we will be able to share what direction we are going to go in. But I just wanted to give everybody an update on where we stand. Of course, we all should recognize that any of these major system changes involves change. And change management is a very, very important part when we go ahead and implement any of these changes. So we also have established a change management team that's actually being led by Doreen on the procurement side, and DFA is supporting us with this entire project, and Shayna Sims from the DFA's office, CFO's office, also is supporting us with the change management piece. The first thing we did with that is we had sent out that survey to all the schools and divisions to understand what is it that they currently have, what are they doing, and what are their concerns with the current process. So we have received a very good response from the various schools and divisions, and we have compiled all the responses, and we are going to incorporate those in the changes that we plan to make. So, that's where we stand today. We hope to have cooperation and support from all of you in making the necessary changes to make the systems more effective and efficient so that we are not doing things manually. As you all know, we do a lot of things via emails outside the KFS system in order for us to communicate with the departments and central procurement and get the necessary information. We hope to have all of that built into the system so that we minimize the external communication, which is outside the system. At the same time, we also know that various schools have their own internal processes on how they get all the information pre-requisition, and hopefully the changes we make in the system, either to KFS or another system that we end up getting, will standardize the way all the departments submit their information and their acquisitions, so there is only one common system across the entire campus and not 23 different ways people are processing the information that needs to be submitted with their acquisition. So that's a very high level, quick overview of where we are with the procurement, end-to-end procurement improvement process. Okay, so as always, our slide decks will contain a slide with all the various resources that we talked about during the training, and you can always refer to them and get more details about it. In this particular one, you have all the information that Brian had shared and the links to the various contents that he discussed during this training today. And then lastly, we have the questions, and then we would like you all, if you could, please take the time to fill out the survey. We'd love to get your feedback so that we know what we can do to improve our trainings. At the same time, we would also like to know what specific topics that you would like us to provide training on so that we can serve you better. Okay, let's go to the questions.
Okay, so we had a few questions come in on the chat there. First, I want to read off a couple of kudos. So great presentation. Thank you, Brian. And then kudos to Helen Chang in the procurement department, who is excellent and has a keen eye experience and skill for the UCI basic needs purchase. So thank you to Helen. We had a question come in. Are the faculty educated on export controls for non-purchasing? So for transfer of information or shipping items that do not go through purchasing. Brian, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, sure. So yes, to a degree. Training right now is not, export controls compliance training is not mandatory for faculty members. Faculty members who, their line of research, crosses into these kinds of technologies and into this space, definitely have some awareness surrounding these topics. But I would not say that all faculty members have that same level of awareness. The faculty member who's actively engaged with, say, DoD or DOE or some of our federal sponsors, they are most likely aware of export controls and have a higher level of understanding. But some of our other faculty members would not. So I would say there's varying degrees of knowledge out there.
Thank you. I have another question for you. Is there any potential export control issue present if a PI has dual citizenship? Let's say the PI ordering a restricted piece of technology.
If the PI or faculty member is a dual citizen of the United States in addition to another country, they would be considered a U.S. person, and there would not be issues with accessing or having access to controlled technology.
Great. Do we have any other questions? Feel free to unmute yourself, raise your hand, or add it to the chat, please. Does not have to be related to export control. It can also be procurement related, anything that we talked about today or anything else, frankly. Procurement related, obviously.
I'm also a big baseball fan, so any baseball questions are fine too.
Moneyball, a good movie.
Wait, what was that?
Is Moneyball a good movie to you?
Yeah, I like Moneyball. I feel like that was kind of a setup. I'm not sure.
Okay. We can end a little early today. I will be uploading our video of this recording on our website. You'll find it on the training website on procurement.uci.edu. And I'll also be sending out a email to everyone who's attended today, or if you've registered, or if you're on my calendar invite, or it's been forwarded to you, you will get the email with all of the slides as well as the recording. Thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you all.
you.
Bye.
Thank you.